There are as many ways to die in the void as there are stars to navigate by. Though Carve's Starfinder had never given the matter much thought until his Magnacoil bike sputtered its last beneath him on that barren moon. The machine gave 3 defiant coughs, like an old man clearing his throat before delivering bad news, and then fell silent. It was the 3rd such failure that month, and as he stood there in the grey dust, watching the machine's spirit lights fade like dying embers, he felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with his suit's temperature regulators. The moon itself was unremarkable. They had catalogued dozens like it over the years. A sphere of rock and regolith, scarred by eons of cosmic bombardment, turning its pocked face through the void with the patient indifference of all celestial bodies. But standing there, with his broken machine at his feet and the stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns, Carve felt the weight of those 32 years pressing down on him like atmospheric pressure. You must understand that the kin are not given to melodrama. They are a practical people, shaped by millennia of survival in the dark spaces between stars, where sentiment is a luxury and efficiency a necessity. Their ancestors learned long ago that the universe cares nothing for hopes or dreams or the promises we make to one another. It simply is vast and cold and bound by laws that predate consciousness itself. And yet, even the most practical soul must occasionally confront mortality, and Carve's was becoming increasingly troublesome. 32 years. He said the number aloud, testing its weight in the thin atmosphere. 32 years since he had walked the halls of Hold Ingvar, since he had felt the reassuring hum of a true forge beneath his feet, since he had shared a proper meal with his kindred in the great feast halls where the air was thick with laughter and the smell of honest food. In all that time, they had mapped 17 systems, catalogued thousands of celestial bodies, identified mineral deposits that would enrich their league for generations. It was good work, necessary work, the kind of work that civilizations are built upon. But standing there with his dead bike, Carve couldn't help but wonder if the price had been too high. The others found him there some hours later, still contemplating his defunct machine with the peculiar intensity of a man doing sums that refuse to balance. Vea came first, as she always did these days, her psychoactive clone skin making her sensitive to disturbances in the band's collective mood. She moved across the lunar surface with the too careful grace of someone who has learned not to trust their own perceptions entirely. "I felt your distress," she said simply, kneeling beside the bike, like a discordant note in a familiar song. She was young, at least by kin standards. When they had set out, she had been eager and bright-eyed, full of questions about the universe and their place in it. Now there was a tightness around her eyes, a way of glancing at shadows that spoke of too many nights spent listening to the whispers between the stars. The isolation wore on her differently than it did the rest. Her enhanced senses, meant to aid in surveying and danger detection, had become a burden in the vast emptiness. Sometimes, in the small hours of the ship night, she would speak of dreams that weren't quite dreams, of patterns in the cosmic background radiation that almost made sense. Behind her came Votann, their Hernkyn navigator, his mechanical form moving with a precision that had lately begun to seem more like stubbornness. The Hernkyn were marvels of kin engineering, artificial beings with true consciousness, created to be perfect partners in the great work of survival and exploration. But even perfection, it seemed, had its limits. Carve had noticed the slight hesitation in Votann's movements lately, the way he would sometimes pause as if trying to remember something important. "Another malfunction," Votann observed, his optical sensors scanning the bike with methodical thoroughness. "The primary coupling has fused. The secondary power cells show signs of quantum degradation. The spirit wafer is," he paused, that troubling hesitation again, "corrupted beyond recovery." And last, because she always checked the perimeter twice before moving, came Haluk, her gait slightly unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the moon's low gravity. She carried her rifle with the casual competence of someone who had been holding weapons longer than some stars had been burning. But there was a slight tremor in her hands that hadn't been there 5 years ago. The flask at her hip caught the distant starlight, and they all politely ignored the fact that it was fuller than regulations strictly allowed. The ancestors weep, Halak muttered, though whether she meant it as a curse or a genuine theological observation was unclear. She took a pull from her flask, not bothering to hide the gesture. That's 3 bikes in a month. At this rate, we'll be walking home. Home. The word hung in the thin air between them like a challenge. What was home to them now? Was it Hold Ingvar with its great forges and feast halls, its crowds and noise and life? Or was it their little ship, with its familiar cramped spaces and recycled air, its walls covered with pictures and mementos from a life that seemed increasingly theoretical? Or was home simply wherever your band made camp for the night, wherever you could rest your head and trust that someone was watching your back? They made camp there, in the shadow of a ridge that provided some shelter from the moon's thin, cutting wind. As they worked to extract what useful components they could from the dead bike, Carve found himself thinking of promises. Specifically, the promise he had made to his chosen brother Grim 32 years ago, on the night before their departure. They had been drunk, gloriously and unashamedly drunk on that potent brew the kin called Griefsend, standing on the observation deck, watching the stars wheel overhead. Grim had been nervous about his upcoming bonding ceremony, fretting about the ceremonies and protocols, wondering if Yiva would regret choosing him when she could have had any warrior in the hold. "You'll be there, won't you?" Grim had asked, gripping Carve's shoulder with the intensity of the deeply intoxicated. "At the ceremony, you'll stand as my oath-keeper." "Of course," Carve had replied, the words coming easily in that warm haze of brotherhood and alcohol. 7 years, 10 at the most. I'll be back with such stories, such riches, that they'll sing of our band for generations. And I'll stand beside you as you speak your vows, and we'll feast until the morning comes. 7 years, 10 at the most. The memory burned like Griefsend going down the wrong way. The ceremony had likely happened decades past. Children had probably been born and raised to adulthood. Grim was probably a grandfather by now, telling stories of his adventurous chosen brother who went to map the stars and never came back. Or perhaps he had stopped telling the stories. Perhaps Carve had become just another name on the rolls of the travelling, neither living nor dead, simply absent. They worked in companionable silence as the stars turned overhead, each lost in their own thoughts. The bike yielded its useful components grudgingly. A few power cells that still held charge, some processing chips that might serve as replacements, precious metals that could be reforged into new parts. It was a familiar ritual by now, this cannibalization of their equipment. They had become experts at making do, at squeezing just a little more life out of machines that should have been decommissioned years ago. As they worked, Carve found himself studying his companions with new eyes. When had Vea's hair begun showing those threads of silver? When had the laugh lines around Halak's eyes become so deep? Even Utan, who shouldn't have shown signs of aging, seemed somehow worn, his metal frame bearing countless small repairs and modifications, like scar tissue on flesh. There were 4 now, where once they had been 8. The void had claimed the others over the years, not dramatically, but in the small, stupid ways that real death usually comes. Gory had miscalculated a jump and materialized inside an asteroid. A 1 in a million chance, the kind of accident that makes you believe in malicious fate. They had found pieces of his bike later, fused with the rock at a molecular level, a monument to the danger of even momentary inattention. Thrymir's death had been even more mundane, a suit failure during what should have been a routine repair, a seal that had held for 15 years, choosing that exact moment to give way. He had been replacing a sensor array on the ship's hull, humming one of those old mining songs he loved, when the breach occurred. By the time they got him inside, it was too late. The void had already claimed him, leaving only a body that looked surprisingly peaceful, as if he had simply decided to take a nap and forgotten to wake up. The twins, Nori and Doki, had simply vanished during a sensor sweep of a gravitational anomaly 2 years ago. They had been investigating some unusual readings at the edge of a system. Their last transmission a cheerful report about interesting spatial distortions that warranted closer inspection. Then static, then nothing. They had searched for weeks, burning precious fuel, following every possible trajectory. But space is vast and unforgiving, and some mysteries it keeps for itself. The long-range comms array is beyond repair, Vaya said quietly as they sat around their portable heating unit that night, the stars wheeling overhead in their ancient, uncaring dance. She had been working on it for days, trying every trick in their considerable repertoire, but some things broken cannot be fixed. The quantum entanglement module is completely degraded. The cascade particles have denatured. We could no more repair it than we could unburn wood. Silence greeted this pronouncement, though it surprised none of them. They had all seen the signs, felt the slow decay of their equipment despite their best efforts at maintenance. The kin built things to last, yes, but even kin engineering had limits. Entropy, that ancient enemy of all ordered systems, had been working its patient destruction. Every component had a lifespan, every system a breaking point, and they had found them all. "So we're alone out here," Halleck said, not a question but a statement of fact. "No way to call for help. No way to report our findings. No way to tell anyone we're still alive." "We have the short-range systems," Votann offered, though they all knew the limitations there. Short-range in space was a cruel joke. You might as well try to communicate by shouting. "How much of the survey do we have left?" Carv asked, though he knew the answer. He had run the numbers himself a dozen times, hoping for a different result. 40% of our assigned sector remains unmapped, Votann replied, his voice carrying that slight mechanical buzz that had grown more pronounced of late. 17 systems completed to full survey standards. 11 remaining, assuming no significant stellar drift from our original projections. "And if we turn back now?" Halleck asked, though this too was a question they all knew the answer to. 18 months to the nearest League outpost, the Hernkyn continued, his optical sensors dimming slightly as he accessed navigation files. "That's assuming optimal conditions, no further equipment failures, and that we can maintain current fuel consumption rates. Out here, assumptions were luxuries they could no longer afford. Every calculation had to include margins for error, contingencies for failure, possibilities for disaster. And even then, the universe had ways of surprising you. "I found something," Halleck said suddenly, producing a data slate from her pack. "In the last system. Didn't want to say anything until I was sure, but..." She activated the display, showing readings that made them all lean forward. Mineral signatures, dense concentrations of rare elements, the kind the forges back home would kill for. They passed the slate around, each studying the readings with professional interest. It was good data, very good. The kind of find that would justify their entire mission if it panned out. The kind that might make their names remembered in the holds for generations. The kind that young Hernkyn would learn about in their training, a textbook example of why the long surveys were worth the risk. "One jump away," Halleck continued. "Maybe two if we're conservative with fuel. We could check it out, confirm the readings, take proper samples." "And then?" Vare asked quietly. "And then we go home," Halleck said firmly. "Complete or not, we go home." They voted, as was the kin way, each voice carrying equal weight regardless of age or rank or the tremor in their hands. The decision was unanimous. One more system, then they would attempt the long journey back. It seemed reasonable at the time. Most disasters do before they unfold. The universe, you see, has a peculiar sense of timing. It waits until hope has taken root, until you've made your plans and set your course, and then it reminds you who is really in charge. They spent 3 days preparing for the journey to the mineral site, checking and double-checking every system, rationing their supplies, running diagnostics on equipment that they knew was failing, but had no choice but to trust. Vare grew increasingly restless during this time, her enhanced senses picking up something the others couldn't quite perceive. She would stop in the middle of tasks, head tilted as if listening to distant music, her eyes unfocused in a way that made Carv deeply uneasy. "There's something wrong with the space here," she said on their last night before departure. "The patterns are twisted, like a song where all the notes are technically correct, but the rhythm is off." "It's just the isolation," Halleck said. They had all felt it, that wrongness in the void around them. Space should be empty, silent, peaceful in its vast indifference. But sometimes, in certain places, it felt actively hostile, as if the universe itself resented their presence. The ancestors walked these paths before us, Utan said, invoking the old comfort. Where they have gone, we can follow. But privately, Carve wondered if the ancestors had ever been this far from home, this alone, this uncertain of the way back. The old stories spoke of heroes who ventured into the dark and returned with wisdom and wealth. They didn't speak much of those who ventured into the dark and simply disappeared, becoming cautionary tales whispered in the holds to frighten young kin into staying close to home. The new system welcomed them with a dense asteroid field that swirled around a moon like insects around a cooling corpse. The mineral readings were stronger here, emanating from somewhere deep within the chaotic rain of rock and ice. They proceeded carefully, their bikes weaving between the tumbling stones. This was what they were trained for, what they were good at. For a brief time, the familiar challenge of navigation pushed aside darker thoughts. Carve took point, as he always did, reading the patterns in the asteroid movements with an intuition that went beyond mere calculation. Behind him, Vare flew with her sensors at maximum sensitivity, calling out hazards in a voice that had regained some of its old confidence. Utan came next, his navigation systems working overtime to plot safe passages through the debris. And Haluk brought up the rear, watching their backs with the paranoid competence of a career survivor. They had done this 1,000 times before in 100 different systems. It should have been routine. But fatigue, you see, is cumulative. It builds up in the bones and the mind like sediment in a filter, and eventually, inevitably, it affects performance. The reflexes slow by microseconds. The attention wavers for just a moment. The hand on the control stick trembles at exactly the wrong time. It was Haluk who made the mistake, though in truth it could have been any of them. It was small, no larger than a fist, tumbling end over end, in a pattern that seemed predictable until it wasn't. Haluk saw it coming, tried to adjust, but her reactions were a heartbeat too slow. Her bike clipped the falling rock with a sound like a bell being struck, and suddenly she was tumbling, her stabilizers screaming as they tried to compensate. What happened next seemed to unfold with the terrible clarity of a nightmare. Her bike, already spinning out of control, struck a larger rock with pulverizing force. The impact threw her from the saddle, sent her tumbling through low gravity like a discarded doll. Her suit's emergency thrusters fired, trying to stabilize her trajectory, but they too were operating on decades-old fuel cells and prayers. Carve was moving before his conscious mind had fully processed what was happening. He caught her just before she would have struck another rock, gathering her gently against his chest, feeling the way her body had gone rigid with pain even through both their suits. "I've got you," he said, the words coming automatically. "You're safe, I've got you." But safe was a relative term out here, and they all knew it. They got her back to the Starwise Oath, their hands steady despite the fear that clawed at their throats. Her suit had held mostly, though they could see the web of cracks across the chest plate where she'd struck the asteroid. The real damage was internal, 3 ribs broken, possibly more, and who knew what else. In a proper medical facility, with proper equipment, it would have been a minor inconvenience. But they were very far from proper anything. Vare worked with quiet efficiency, cutting away the damaged portions of Haluk's suit, administering what pain medication they had left. Their medical supplies, once so carefully stocked, had dwindled over the years. They had antibiotics, yes, but only a few doses. Pain medication, but barely enough for a few days. Tissue regenerators that might or might not still function after so long in storage. "Well," Haluk said through gritted teeth as Vare wrapped her ribs, "at least it's not boring." They laughed because they had to, because not laughing would mean acknowledging how bad the situation really was. But the laughter had a brittle quality, like ice over deep water. "I'll be fine," Haluk insisted, though her face was grey with pain and her breathing came in careful, shallow gasps. "Just need rest. Few days and I'll be right as rain." But infection, as anyone who has lived far from civilization knows, is a patient enemy. It crept into Haluk's body through some microscopic breach in their treatment, some tiny failure in their decades-old medical equipment. Within 2 days, she was burning with fever despite the carefully controlled temperature of the ship. Within 3, she was delirious, calling out for people who weren't there, fighting battles that had ended years ago. They gave her what antibiotics they had left, but it was like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teacup. The infection had taken hold, and their resources were simply inadequate to fight it. They took turns sitting with her, cooling her fever with damp cloths, talking to her through the delirium, pretending that everything would be fine. It was during one of these vigils, as Carv sat beside their failing comrade, that Votann made his confession. The Ironkin had been growing increasingly agitated over the past days, his movements uncertain, his responses delayed. Finally, he could contain it no longer. "The corruption in my navigation files is worse than I have indicated," he said, his optical sensors unable to meet Carv's eyes. "Much worse. Whole star charts are degraded or missing, reference points scrambled or simply gone. I have been extrapolating, guessing, you might say. For months now, I have been guiding us based on probability rather than certainty." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Without accurate navigation, they were truly lost. Even if they decided to turn back immediately, they might never find their way home. They might wander the void until their supplies ran out. Another band of Hernkyn added to the rolls of the vanished. "How bad?" Carv asked quietly. "I estimate a 30% chance of successful navigation back to League space," Votann replied. "Perhaps 40% if we can find recognizable stellar landmarks. But with each jump, each day that passes, more data corrupts. My memory cores are failing, and I cannot stop the decay. 30%, 40% at best." The arithmetic grew ever more troublesome. "We should have turned back years ago," Vea said softly from where she sat by Haluk's bedside. "When Gori died, when the twins vanished, we should have seen the signs." "The signs were always there," Carv replied. "We simply chose not to read them. We told ourselves one more system, one more survey, one more discovery. We thought we were being brave. Perhaps we were simply being foolish." "The two are not mutually exclusive," Votann observed, and despite everything, they smiled at that. It was Vea who suggested they investigate the source of the mineral readings, if only to give Haluk time to recover. They all knew it was a fiction. Haluk was not going to recover without proper medical intervention. But sometimes fiction is all that stands between us and despair. What they found there changed everything. The derelict hung in space, its hull scarred by decades of micro-impacts. The design was familiar, comforting even in its familiarity. This was no alien artifact or ancient mystery. This was the work of their own people, recent enough that some of the external lights still flickered in their death throes. The markings on the hull identified it as the Far Trader's Dream, belonging to their own league. Carv knew the name, every Hernkyn did. Reported lost with all hands, somewhere in the vicinity of the Ghoul stars. Their final transmission had been a routine survey update. They docked carefully, unsure what they might find. The Far Trader's Dream was a mirror of their own vessel, designed for the same purpose, crewed by the same kind of people. Walking through its silent corridors was like exploring their own future, a preview of coming attractions that none of them had asked to see. The crew were still at their posts, preserved by the vacuum in terrible detail. The captain, a grizzled veteran named Duri according to the logs, sat in his command chair, hands still resting on controls that would never respond again. The engineers were in the engine room, frozen in the act of trying to repair systems that had failed beyond their ability to fix. Everywhere, the signs of gradual system failure, of a crew that had fought to the very end against the inevitable. The logs told a story terrifyingly similar to their own. Equipment failures cascading one into another. Navigation errors compounding. Supplies dwindling despite careful rationing. The entries grew shorter as the situation deteriorated. "They made it further than anyone knew," Carv observed, studying their star charts. The Far Trader's Dream had been almost 200 light-years beyond their last reported position. They were trying to come home. "And it did them no good," Haluk whispered from the stretcher where they had brought her, insisting on seeing what they had found. The fever had broken, but it had taken much of her strength with it. She looked diminished, fragile in a way that Carv had never associated with the tough old surveyor. It was Votann who found the beacon, tucked away in the derelict's emergency supplies like a last hope. It was a good piece of kin engineering, built to last, though its power cells were nearly depleted after 15 years of silent waiting. Enough for one short-range burst, perhaps. Enough to maybe, possibly, reach a League patrol if one happened to be within a few light years. We could activate it, Vare suggested. Send out a call for help. And if no one hears, Haluk asked. Then we're no worse off than we are now, Carve replied. But that wasn't quite true, was it? Hope, once kindled, burns fuel just like engines do. And when it gutters out, it leaves you colder than you were before. They argued about it, as people in desperate circumstances do. The argument had the quality of a ritual, each of them taking positions they didn't quite believe, testing the alternatives like someone probing a sore tooth. Some wanted to activate the beacon immediately. Others pointed out that it would drain power they might need for other systems. The discussion went in circles, each revolution bringing them back to the same inescapable conclusion. They were running out of options. It was Haluk who broke the deadlock, speaking with a devastating practicality. Leave me here, she said quietly. Activate the beacon, wait a reasonable time for rescue. If none comes, continue on. The protests were immediate and vehement, but she cut through them with a raised hand. I'm dying, she said simply. We all know it. The infection is too deep, and we don't have the means to fight it. Every day you wait for me to recover is a day of supplies consumed, a day closer to all of us joining this ghost ship. I've had a good run, longer than most. Let me make my death count for something. They rejected this, of course, with the vehemence of those who know they might eventually have to accept it. Carve spoke of duty to one's bandmates. Vare invoked the ancient traditions of never leaving anyone behind. Even Votann, logical to his core, argued that her experience was invaluable, that they needed every hand for the journey ahead. But in the end, they reached a compromise, as people do when all choices are bad. They would activate the beacon and wait 1 month for rescue. If none came, they would reassess. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was something to hold on to, a framework to hang their days upon. Hope is a peculiar thing. It can sustain you through the most terrible circumstances, but it can also make those circumstances more terrible by its presence. Those first days after they activated, the beacon were filled with a brittle kind of optimism. They threw themselves into work with renewed energy, making repairs to both ships, salvaging what they could, preparing for either rescue or the long journey ahead. They moved Haluk to the Far Trader's Dreams medical bay, which was marginally better equipped than their own. Some of the equipment still functioned, after a fashion, and they were able to make her more comfortable. The antibiotics seemed to be having some effect, or perhaps it was simply the psychological boost of feeling like they were doing something. She even managed to joke about being the queen of 2 ships, holding court from her medical bed. Vare spent hours with the beacon, fine-tuning its signal, boosting its range with every trick she knew. She painted their situation in the electromagnetic spectrum, a cry for help written in frequency and amplitude. The beacon sang their distress into the void, and they waited for the void to answer. Carve found himself returning often to the Far Trader's Dreams command center, sitting in the captain's chair, reading through the logs of another leader who had faced the same impossible choices. Captain Dury had been a poet, it seemed, given to philosophical musings between the dry recitation of survey data. His personal logs were full of observations about the nature of exploration, the price of knowledge, the meaning of home. We go into the dark because we must, not for glory or riches, though those are welcome when they come. We go because that is what the kin have always done. We push against the boundaries of the known, and in pushing, we define ourselves. Sometimes the dark pushes back. That too is part of the definition. Votann busied himself trying to reconstruct his corrupted navigation files, cross-referencing with the Far Trader's Dreams computers. It was painstaking work, comparing star positions and galactic drift, trying to build a coherent picture from 2 incomplete data sets. Sometimes he would make a breakthrough, recovering a crucial reference point or navigation marker. More often, he would discover that both data sets were corrupted in the same ways, 2 witnesses to the same lie. Days became weeks with the peculiar timelessness of deep space. They fell into routines, as humans and kin always do when faced with waiting. Morning checks of the communication array, afternoon maintenance and salvage operations, evening meals taken together, telling stories they had all heard before, pretending the food had flavor, pretending tomorrow might be different. Halak seemed to stabilize, even improve slightly. The infection had not spread, though neither had it fully retreated. She was weak but lucid, able to sit up for short periods, even managing to win a few hands of cards despite Vea's psychoactive advantages. They allowed themselves to hope that perhaps, against all odds, she might pull through. But bodies, like machines, have their limits, and sometimes what looks like recovery is simply a gathering of strength for the final decline. It was on the 23rd day that Halak took her final turn. They had moved her back to their own ship the night before, at her request. She wanted to be among familiar things, she said. Her own bunk, her own belongings, the pictures of her whole family that she had carried for 32 years. They should have recognized it for what it was, a preparation, a setting of affairs in order. But hope makes us blind to such signals. She died as she had lived, quietly and without fuss, somewhere in the small hours of the night cycle. Carv found her in the morning when he came to bring her breakfast, looking more peaceful than she had in months. The pain lines had smoothed from her face, and she wore the faint smile of someone who has finally solved a difficult problem. They prepared her body with the care of those who have too much time and too little else to occupy their hands. Vea sang the old songs, her voice cracking on the high notes but pushing through anyway. Carv spoke the words that would guide her to the ancestors, though privately he wondered if the ancestors could hear them so far from home, or if their words, like their beacon, simply dissipated into the uncaring void. They buried her in space, as was fitting for a Hernkyn Pioneer. Her body, wrapped in what remained of her void suit, would drift among the stars until the end of time, or until some gravity well claimed her. They attached a small transponder, though they knew no one would likely ever detect it. It was the gesture that mattered, the assertion that she had been here, she had mattered, would be remembered. She was the best of us, Vea said, as they watched Halak's body drift away into the star field. She was certainly the most honest, Carv replied. She never pretended things were other than they were. A valuable trait, Votann observed, and one we would do well to emulate. The last week of their vigil passed in a kind of numb determination. They salvaged what they could, compiled all the survey data from both expeditions, prepared for what they all knew was coming. The beacon continued its lonely song, but no answer came from the darkness. On the 30th day, they gathered in the common room of the Starwise Oath. Supplies for 4 months at current rationing, Carv reported. 6 if we push it, but that leaves no margin for error. Navigation confidence at 35% for a return journey, Votann added. I have recovered what I can from the Far Trader's Dreams computers, but much of their data is similarly corrupted. The ship is holding together barely, Vea said. With the parts from what we've salvaged, we might keep it running for the duration. They sat in silence for a long moment, each lost in their own calculations. Finally, Carv spoke again. We have 3 choices. We can stay here and hope someone eventually investigates the beacon. We can attempt to complete our survey mission and then return. Or we can attempt the journey home now with what we have. Staying is death, Vea said bluntly. Slow death, but death nonetheless. No one is coming. We're too far out, and the League has probably already written us off. Completing the mission is madness, Votann added. We lack the resources and the equipment. We would be adding risk for no meaningful gain. Which left the third option, the impossible option, the only option. Then we go home, Carv said simply. Or we try. It was not hope that drove them, you understand. Hope had been buried with Halak among the stars. It was something quieter, more fundamental. The simple refusal to wait for death when one could move toward it instead. They were kin, and the kin had not survived the millennia by giving up when the numbers looked bad. Sometimes, you played the odds not because you expected to win, but because not playing was its own form of defeat. They spent 2 days preparing, with the thoroughness of those who know they will have no second chances. Every system was checked and double-checked. Every spare part catalogued and packed. They transferred all the survey data to multiple storage devices, sealed in hardened cases that might survive even if they didn't. They left behind a record of their findings, their names, and Haluk's marker for any who might come after. Carve's last personal log entry, recovered much later, reads simply, "We go to the ancestors by the long road. May those who come after learn from our journey. The stars are beautiful and terrible, and we have loved them both." They departed on the 32nd day, moving into the vast darkness, following the ghost trails of corrupted navigation data toward a home that might no longer exist in any way they would recognize. The far trader's dream remained behind, its beacon still singing songs into the void. The journey that followed was neither heroic nor dramatic. It was simply hard, in the way that true endurance always is. They jumped from system to system, following Votann's best guesses and the fragmentary data recovered from the derelict. Sometimes they found familiar stars and their spirits lifted. More often, they found themselves in uncharted space, with no reference points and no way to know if they were moving toward home or simply deeper into the dark. They rationed carefully, but bodies need fuel just as surely as engines do. The food gave out first, despite their best efforts. They had planned for 6 months, but delays and detours stretched the journey longer. They switched to emergency rations, those dense blocks of compressed nutrients that could keep you alive, but reminded you with every bite that living and surviving were not the same thing. Vaya grew thinner, her psychoactive abilities becoming both more pronounced and less controlled. She spoke of patterns in the void, great currents of meaning that flowed between the stars. Sometimes she could predict gravitational anomalies before the sensors detected them. Sometimes she simply stared at nothing, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by perceptions the others couldn't share. Votann's degradation accelerated, perhaps pushed by the strain of constant navigation through uncertain space. He began to forget things, not just data, but experiences, conversations, people. He would ask about Haluk, forgetting she was gone, and they would have to tell him again, listening to the grief fresh in his mechanical voice each time. And Carve endured. That is what leaders do when there are no good choices left. He made the decisions that had to be made, spoke the words that needed to be spoken, and in the quiet moments, he allowed himself to remember what they were trying to return to. Hold Ingvar with its great halls, Grim with his nervous smile, the taste of real food, the sound of laughter, the feeling of solid ground beneath his feet. The journey that was taking everything they had and demanding more. 2 years later, a League patrol vessel, following up on what they assumed was a garbled distress signal, found the beacon site. The captain, a young kin named Fury who had grown up on stories of the great Hernkyn Pioneers, ordered a thorough investigation. They found the compiled data of 2 expeditions, worth a fortune in mineral rights and navigation routes. The information was immediately transmitted back to the League, where it caused a sensation. New systems, new resources, new possibilities for expansion. The bureaucrats were ecstatic. The forges began planning extraction operations. The merchant guilds calculated profits. They found Haluk's marker and the recorded rights, which they transmitted back to her hold with full honors. Her kin, who had long since given her up for lost, held a proper funeral at last, speaking her name in the great halls, adding her deeds to the sagas. They found evidence of the 3 who had departed. The patrol followed the trail as far as they could. The trail led them through 17 systems, a wandering path that spoke of navigation errors and course corrections, of detours around unexpected obstacles. In one system they found a burnt-out bike, its components carefully stripped for parts. The frame bore Vaya's personal marks, and the patrol's psychoactive specialist reported lingering traces of her presence, like an electromagnetic echo of distress. 2 systems further, they found another cache of discarded equipment, including several data storage devices. Most were corrupted beyond recovery, but one contained a partial log. Day 97. Vaya's episodes are worsening. She speaks of a presence in the void, something vast and patient. Votann's memory failures now include recent events. He asks every morning where we are going. I tell him home. It seems kinder than the truth. Day 112. The thing Vare senses is real. We all feel it now, a wrongness in space itself. The instruments detect nothing, but our bones know. We're changing course, adding weeks to our journey. Some things are worse than being lost. Day 130. Found an automated mining station, abandoned but functional, able to resupply water and basic nutrients. Small miracles. Vare seems calmer. She says the presence has passed. I choose to believe her. Day 141. Votann forgot my name today. 32 years of friendship, and I am a stranger to him. I tell myself it's just data corruption, that the soul of my friend remains even if the memories are gone. I almost believe it. After that, the trail went cold. The patrol followed every possible trajectory, scanned every system within range, but found nothing more. The three had vanished. The League declared Carve, Vare, and Votann traveling to the ancestors, that peculiar kin euphemism for those whose fate remains unknown. Neither dead nor alive in the official records, but something in between, like a quantum particle that hasn't been observed. Their names were added to the rolls of honor, their families compensated, their story told in the holds as a cautionary tale about the dangers of the void. But stories, like space, have a way of expanding over time. The mineral site they discovered became a way station for future Hernkyn, a place to rest and resupply before pushing further into the dark. They called it Last Light Station, and it grew from a simple supply cache to a small outpost to a thriving transit hub. Each expedition that stops there leaves something behind: a marker, a prayer, a small offering to those who went before. Halak's grave has become something of a shrine. Hernkyn Pioneers, that unsentimental breed, stop there to pay their respects before venturing into the deep void. They leave small tokens, a favorite tool, a pict of their hold family, a flask of good liquor. They speak a name and add their own to the growing list of those who walk the dark paths. The compiled survey data proved more valuable than anyone could have imagined. The 17 systems mapped by Carve's band contained enough mineral wealth to fund League operations for centuries. New holds were established, new trade routes opened. The Starwise Oath sacrifice had not been in vain, at least from the cold perspective of economics and expansion. Carve's chosen brother, Old Grim, lived to see his friend declared a hero of the League. He named his firstborn after Carve, keeping alive the hope that somewhere, somehow, three lights still moved through the darkness, following the long road home. Young Carve grew up on stories of his namesake, of the uncle who had gone to map the stars and might yet return with tales of wonders beyond imagining. When young Carve came of age, he too joined the Hernkyn Pioneers, despite his parents' protests. On his first Deep Void expedition, he made a point of visiting Last Light Station, of standing before Halak's shrine, of looking out at the stars that had claimed so many and would claim so many more. "I'm looking for you, uncle," he said to the void. "We all are. Every pioneer who pushes a little further, maps one more system, takes one more risk. We're all looking for you. And if you're out there, if you can hear this, know that you are not forgotten. Know that your name is still spoken in the holds. Know that we remember." The universe, of course, gave no answer. It never does. But young Carve thought he felt something in that moment, a presence, a whisper, a sense of connection across the vast dark. It was probably just his imagination, but he chose to believe it was more, because sometimes belief is all that stands between us and the abyss.